Welcome back to Tales Arcane. In this video I'm going to cover what I believe is the most important rule of immersive world building. This will apply to D&D campaign settings, but really to any fantasy TTRPG. I'll start by explaining quickly what the rule is, and then I'll give you 3 in-depth examples of how this rule applies in practice. By the way, this video is sponsored by the Fabled Empire Kickstarter. This is a new 5e supplement inspired by classic fairy tales and fae folklore. The final book will be close to 200 pages in length and will include new player options, new villains and monsters, magic items, and a lot more. The Fabled Empire provides a fae demiplane, and it lends itself well to a wide range of stories, from Arthurian romance to whimsical Celtic folklore to darker Germanic tales. The player options all lean into that fairy tale tone. For example, there's the foretold background, which is for players who want to be the subject of prophecy. You can just imagine a character whose dark destiny was foretold at their birth by a hag, and now that prophecy looms over them. The writers behind the Fabled Empire are putting a lot of unique whimsical details into the world. I really like, for example, the fact that hollow trees can sometimes just spontaneously turn into portals to other hollow trees, and no one really knows why, but it's a great immersive way to add a portal network into the world without actually calling it fast travel. If you want to back the Kickstarter, you want to get your hands on the Fabled Empire book, just head to the link in the description below this video. A huge thank you to Nat Handsome Games, the team behind the Kickstarter, for being today's sponsor. When you're world building, you're creating a lot of individual components. Factions, nations, gods, monsters, specific locations like towns and villages. You take all of these individual components, and your setting is like the big stage on which each of these components will be set for your players to explore. In my opinion, the #1 rule for immersive world building is that no single component in your world should exist without affecting or being affected by at least 3 or more other components. No single element should exist in a vacuum. By the same token, the biggest mistake I see people make in world building is to put elements into their world that just do not affect or reflect anything around them. These elements technically all exist in the same space, but they exist in little silos, and the players go from silo to silo without seeing any connective tissue between them. Ideally, I think you should be able to almost infer the presence of any individual component in your world based not on the component itself, but on other components around it, which have been influenced and shaped by it. And to illustrate this, we're going to go over 3 examples: a monster, a god, and a king. For this example, we'll use a classic monster, dragons. Now, we all want to have dragons in our fantasy worlds, but you can either have them as a sort of tacked on threat. They guard treasure and every now and then they attack the players. Or you can integrate them into the world using 3 or 4 particular areas that they've had an impact on. And as a result of that secondary approach, what you'll find is that players will be able to tell that this is a world with dragons in it, even if they never encounter dragons themselves, although they probably will eventually. Here are 4 simple ways to make dragons an immersive, impactful threat in your fantasy world building. Number 1, towns and villages have bunkers and tunnel systems built in underneath them, and at the sound of an alarm bell, villagers are ready to dive into the safety below the town. If you're regularly attacked by dragons, you're going to have protocols to try and defend yourself. In addition to the alarm bells, most of these towns will have aerial defense systems, large ballista and trebuchet pointing skyward to try and take out the threat as it approaches. 2, if there are fire-breathing red dragons flying overhead on a regular basis, potions of fire resistance are going to be in very high demand. Your players may notice that whenever they visit an apothecary, fire resistance potions are either sold out or going for extremely high prices because the production isn't keeping up with the demand. 3, if dragons have been a threat for a long time, the most dominant religion in the area will probably represent dragons as the ultimate evil and show their deity as some kind of heroic dragon slayer. Religious iconography will focus on heroic heroic figures cutting down dragons in battle, because in a world with active evil dragons, the god most worth following is the one who offers to protect you from those dragons. 4. Burnt out villages and towns should be seen from time to time scattered across the land. No matter how effective the defences are, sometimes dragons get through, and the players might just see in the distance trails of smoke rising across the horizon from a farmstead or a small farming community that's just been hit by the latest dragon attack. It might not feature heavily in the questline, the players aren't being called to rush in and defend the village, they just know that somewhere out there the people of this land are continuing to deal with the ongoing threat of the dragons. Your campaign might have nothing to do with dragons, and your players may never actually come into direct contact with one, but they'll know that they're out there, and they'll know that the world they're in is shaped by the presence of those dragons, and that's going to be far more immersive than just tacking them on as an afterthought because it's a fantasy setting and fantasy settings have dragons. Now let's say we're designing a god for your world, perhaps one god amid a wider pantheon. We'll say for this example that we're designing the harvest god, and they're called Harvestia. I know, how do I come up with it? Obviously, if you're not worried about immersive world building, you can just say, sure, there's a god of the harvest and maybe farmers worship them. But we are concerned about immersive world building, so here are 4 ways that the presence of this god and its worship has shaped the world. 1. Temples. The most obvious step is to add temples to Harvestia throughout our world, but we want to be thoughtful about this. We don't just put a temple in every town, because Harvestia worship probably isn't particularly big in urban centres or in coastal regions. We're going to find Harvestian temples in small rural communities where farmers really are relying on a good harvest. 2. While travelling, our players are going to notice small Harvestian shrines in the fields themselves. A lot of farmers' fields will have a large tree in the centre, providing shade for workers when they take a break on a hot day. So we'll say that built into the base of these trees, perhaps partially carved from the wood, are little shrines to Harvestia, and the farmers can, on their break, make a small offering, maybe take a little piece of their lunch for that day and place it on the shrine. 3. Gods have festivals and feast days, so we should think about when Harvestia's feast days are going to come up, probably around the autumn time. We can probably say that from the period of about August through to October, there's going to be a big uptick in people thinking about and worshipping Harvestia. Players will notice, if they're travelling at this time of year, a lot of festivals popping up, perhaps more religious iconography appearing around people's houses, people wearing Harvestian talismans throughout the harvest season. And this won't go out through the entire year, but it just shows the players that this particular part of the year is really associated with this particular deity. 4. We'll create a rival sect that is in opposition to Harvestia, so even when players are dealing with people who aren't Harvestians, they'll be reminded of the god's presence in the world. We'll say that our rival sect worships a god of the forest, and hold on to your hats, we'll call them Forestia. Forestian worshippers believe that we shouldn't be relying on harvesting and agriculture for food. Instead, we should be relying on the yield of the forest, on foraging and hunting within woodlands. And perhaps players will see Forestian priests standing at the sides of fields, heckling farm workers. Maybe there'll be clashes in the streets between them on market day. Maybe a sort of Martin Luther-esque figure will be going around nailing Forestian literature up to the doors of Harvestian temples. When it comes to gods and deities, there is a temptation to just lore dump information onto the cleric at some point when they make a religion check, or hand the players the information in a PDF during the session 0. But I think a far better way to do it is to think about how this god has shaped the world around the players, and then seed in these small elements. So even if they never hear the name Harvestia, even if Harvestian worship isn't a major part of the plotline they're on, they still get a sense that there is a god out there, a god of the harvest, and their worshippers are integrated deeply into this world. Finally, as our third example, let's say we have a king ruling the realm. The reason I bring this up is that often I find in shallow fantasy settings, it's way too easy just to say a wise king rules the land and then never actually have that king integrated into the story in any way. I've run campaigns and played in campaigns where it almost felt as if there was no one ruling the land because we never came into contact with them until the point in the story when it suddenly became convenient to say, oh yeah, there's been a king this whole time and they want to see you and reward you for killing that dragon. So we don't want to go down that road. Instead, we're going to have 4 ways to really show the presence of the king in the world long before the players ever get close to them. 1. Imagery of the king is everywhere. Statues of the king can be seen in most town squares. Portraits of the king hang in the offices of mayors, watchmasters, and city officials. The king's face is printed on every gold coin in the player's purse. The king wants people to remember who's in charge, and so those reminders are there throughout everyday life. 2. Our king will have a force of royal guards who operate at a higher level of authority from your regular city watch types. For this example, we'll call them crown wardens, and we'll say that whenever there's some serious trouble, perhaps a hint of a rebellion, the crown wardens will be deployed and they'll take over from local law enforcement. It's a little bit like the FBI being deployed when a particularly unusual incident happens and they come in to take over from the local police department. 3. The king presumably worships one god in particular, and so that religion is going to have the favour of the crown. The players might notice that wherever they go, temples to that particular deity are very grand and well funded. And harkening back to what we were talking about with Harvestia, in this situation, that particular god might be worshipped in all sorts of places, even when it's not really appropriate. You might find, if the king is a Harvestian worshipper, temples to the harvest god in urban centres, even though there's no one there who normally worships the harvest. They're built at the king's decree. And 4, if there's a king, maybe there's also a movement against the monarchy. Your players will overhear conversations in taverns between disgruntled civilians who think that maybe it's time to found a republic. Perhaps radical pamphlets and banned books are being circulated. Maybe there are even religious figures who back a shift to republicanism, who are standing on the street corners decrying the decadence of the monarchy and calling for a new age led by the people before they get dragged away by the nearby crown wardens. Even if the players aren't directly interacting with the king, when they talk to people who are against the king, they'll be reminded, oh yeah, this is that's who's in charge in this realm. Will your players pick up on every single one of your beautiful immersive details? Absolutely not, but they will pick up on a few here and there, and perhaps more importantly, I think on a subconscious level, they will start to get the sense, even if they don't really know why, that this world is deeply interconnected. It lives and breathes even when they're not there. Everything in the world, each individual component, is speaking to all the other individual components. If you want to check if you've applied this rule to the settings that you're currently working on, go to that setting, pick a random component, a city, a faction, a powerful ruler, just something in there that you can isolate, and ask yourself, would I be able to infer the presence of this thing from a couple of other elements around it? If the answer is yes, you're on the right track. But that is the video. Thank you so much for watching. A massive thank you to Nat Handsome Games and the Fabled Empire Kickstarter. Remember, if you want to back the Kickstarter or just check out their campaign page, you can go down to the link below this video. I really appreciate them sponsoring the channel. All the people who have come on this year so far to sponsor videos are really making a massive difference for me. And yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.